With the terrible events of the final clash ended and the ghosts released into our system, the events that would make up the collapse would come to a close. But there was one far stranger account from the collapse that was given, an account from one of the Exodus program vessels that hit the asteroid belt just as the darkness was approaching in earnest. This vessel, Exodus Green, alternatively known as Yang Liwei, would become the crucible of the forces of light and dark, and would become the birthplace of an entirely new species of beings. It is here, in these most calamitous of moments, that the people known as the Awoken were born. What follows next is another account that is shrouded in mystery, a report of how a new kind of being was brought into our world, one of both the light and the dark, of the deep and the sky. They were known as the Awoken. Their history is recorded in a series of documents, but the most notorious of these is known as the Mara Sena, which talks of the rise of their entire civilization and how they came to join humanity in the struggle that had consumed them. It speaks of a great rift not only at the center of the Awoken soul, but also, in time, within the Awoken people. A people that would be riven by circumstance, choice, and their leaders. The Mara Sena also comes with a warning, namely that in our attempts to grasp its truth, we may in fact mistakenly learn to believe a lie. It is therefore once again at this point that I should state that the story of the Awoken's creation is told through a single source, and that the truth of the matter may yet elude us. But with that said, yet again it is our only source of context, and so, as best we know it, this is the history of the Awoken people. Aboard one of the Exodus program vessels, Exodus Green, alternatively known as Yang Liwei, the captain, Alice Lee, detected a strange signal that was following them for approximately 18 hours in radio silence. After repeatedly ignored hails, and just as Captain Lee cut the engines so that she might make a sharp about turn and face their ghostly stalker, a message was received from the Warmind Rasputin. Rasputin had detected a hostile extrasolar intruder in the system and had initiated a Kahe-White emergency, bringing all of the potential weapons in the system under his control. Rasputin demanded control of the Exodus Green and its onboard guns. But as Captain Alice Lee decided what to do next, torn between her colonial mission and her duty to Earth, darkness swarmed around the hull of the ship, and through its veil, even the light could not be seen. Terrible gravity waves shook the ship as they simultaneously compressed and expanded every molecule of the crew and their vessel. After the vote from the crew came in to continue onward instead of returning to Earth, Alice Lee attempted to send a signal broadcasting a declaration of neutrality to their unknown assailant. Alice Lee stated that they wished to be treated as a separate species that was not party to baseline human conflicts or their allegiance to the Traveler. She prayed that this would be enough to make a difference against such an indifferent darkness. It was at this moment that two members of the crew were out on the hull. One of them had followed the other out. The first of them, Mara, had gone out there to die alone. She had kicked off the hull with 50 kilometers worth of tether, and her brother, Aldwin, had followed her out into the darkness. As the message requesting the massive entity's indifference was broadcast by the captain, the darkness around them abated, and Mara saw a pinprick of light. It was at this moment that Mara found herself and all the occupants of the crew of the ship behind her, threatened to be crushed between the mighty presence of light that had just arrived and the terrible darkness that swarmed the area. The colossal forces of light and dark that clashed here smashed into one another yet again, filling the space with so much power and energy that the universe itself struggled to maintain what bounds of law that it could. This was a battleground that was being decimated by the powers of two paracausal entities. It was like dividing by zero or counting infinity. And as the two violent entities finally reached an equilibrium, the real effect of the power began to manifest. The universe created a singularity, a gaping black hole, as an effort was made to cease the paracausal forces that were tearing the very seams of reality apart. The forces of the universe swirled and buffeted around Mara, and it was at this moment that the mistakes of the universe were to be swallowed inside the singularity. Everything pulled forth, and darkness and light continued to fight. And at this moment, Mara made a choice that would change the universe. She detached herself from the 50 kilometers of tether that joined her and the ship, and together, all were pulled down into the singularity. All of them had the same fate, to be swallowed by this black hole. But Mara knew what she wanted. Mara knew her fate. She reached out at the edge of death and knew that she would be the first. But it was not death and sweet silence that found her. Instead, it was new life and a place of miracles. The Awoken records next speak of Captain Alice Lee experiencing a primordial divinity of sorts. As her existence increased in complexity, she developed a small sense of purpose that grew and blossomed until she willed into existence the world that she wished to have found for her people, and in doing so, willed herself into that world as a being not of divine presence, but still of an immortal one. Then she fell to this earth and lived upon it. She believed herself to be the first among the new peoples, and perhaps the only one. But then, lying on a black stone, somewhere near a crashed remnant of the ship, she discovered Mara. As Mara woke, she realized where they were, in a world of incredible bounty within the folded fabric of hidden space-time. They were inside the black hole. Alice Lee inquired why it was Mara that happened to be second. Mara stated that she didn't know. The first lie to be told upon this new world. But Alice Lee believed her, and so they went on to rouse their new people into this new world. And so it was that the crew was roused, and out of the original 40,900 crew members of Yang Lewei, 40,891 awoke, with 9 being unaccounted for. A council was called, and it led the new people to declare certain principles and verdicts. They called themselves the Awoken, and they were immortal. They called their new world within the singularity the Distributory, and they believed that they should never return from where they had been. They created a group of specialists called UTECs to care for the technology of the ship from which they had emerged, and decreed that under careful supervision they would reproduce with wombs of flesh and machine, given that any they added to their number would be immortal too. The population of the new Awoken people was greatly imbalanced, with 3 times more women than there were men, and as a result, until more men were born, they were placed under the protection of the women. Above all, some of the most important verdicts created at this council were the 6th, 7th, and 8th, stating respectively that the Awoken should know and love the cosmos, that the Awoken were created from a covenant of light and dark, but that the covenant was complete and no further debt should be paid, and finally, that the Awoken were whole in themselves, existing in balance. It was also at this meeting that a final 9th verdict was declared, which was that unanimously the people would recognize Alice Lee as their queen. And so the Awoken went out and explored their new world, charting its seas, forests, and stars. This was a great time of creation and pioneering for the new people, and whilst Alice Lee declared as her first rule that there would be no secrets amongst the Awoken, even here, in this place of new paradise and prosperity, conflict would brew. The Awoken spread across the face of the distributory, and took on as many diverse lifestyles as one could imagine, from intrepid hunters to great seafarers to sage scholars. But amongst those people, differences of opinion would dwell, and some would come to doubt their purpose on this world. Some dwelt within the cities and preached the doctrine that revered the seventh verdict, that the Awoken were made from the completed covenant of light and dark, and that their debt was completely paid. They believed wholeheartedly that their place within the universe carried no responsibilities, and there would be no repercussions for their action. But those who dwelt within the country, as many Awoken did, were of the Ekalist belief, who did not believe in the seventh verdict, and saw that the clash of titanic forces that birthed them was still going on. They believed that they owed a cosmic debt, one that would eventually need to be repaid. These two ideologies could not be so easily brought into balance. The Ekalists and their opposing sanguine believers were divided, but then a spark ignited a flame. An Ekalist known as the Diaserm walked into the cities and loudly accused Queen Alice Lee of deicide, the murder of gods. When questioned about this claim, she stated that when Alice Lee had created the world, she could have conceived of it to create the Awoken as gods so that they might be free from all forms of suffering and pain. Immortality was one thing, but to be truly powerful, and yet to be denied this? Deicide was an appropriate term, perhaps. If this was true, this represented an original sin, and what's more, it represented a secret that Alice had kept, even as she had declared that the Awoken were not to keep secrets. The division between those that believed they owed a debt to the cosmos and those that did not ultimately led to a conflict between the Awoken peoples known as the Theodicy Wars. And whilst the nature of the conflict, at least in the Mara Sena, is indicated to be of a smaller nature, nonetheless, people died, and the balance between the two sides had to be struck and a truce negotiated. Alice Lee petitioned Mara Sov, who had been part of the Ekalist camp, to find her mother, who was a skilled negotiator and could broker the peace. The mother of Mara and Aldrin, who had been returned to life as Aldrin, saw through Mara's games, however, and saw part of the truth, which was that Mara, not the Diaserm, was the source of the Ekalist movement. The Diaserm was merely a pawn. This was part of the truth, but not the whole truth, a truth that was known only to Mara for a great deal of time. The monarchy of the Awoken would in time wane in power, and a new group of scholars would come to be the most influential body of rulers. They were known as the Jensum scribes, some of whom still persist in the warlock orders of today. The scribes, who would routinely send Jensum knights on missions to test the reality that they had been studying, knew that Mara and Aldrin were gathering lore and prophecies pointing towards the potential day when the Ekalists would be proven correct, and when the Awoken would need to repay their debt. The Jensum scribes knew that this could cause another Theodicy war, and so when a tall, strong warrior named Sieur Ido walked into the court of the scribes and demanded the knowledge necessary to hunt and kill Mara for her supposed murder of the Diaserm, the Jensum scribes obliged, and gave Sieur the knowledge she would need to hunt down Mara. However, a second Awoken queen was rising to prominence in the Awoken monarchy. Ngoya Pin received a cloaked and masked woman in her court one day, whispered by some to be Mara and others to be the Diaserm. Whatever the case, it mattered not, for after a long time of having the cloaked figure reside within her court, the monarch declared herself a true Ekalist. She bound the ambition and knowledge of the Gensum scribes to the Echolist's preferred task, and so the scribes set about on the course of attempting to understand if the Awoken owed the cosmos a debt or not. The royal palace was turned into a center of learning and a feast of ideas that radically advanced the Echolist cause. Into this feast strode Sieur Ido, her cloak and longbow at her side. She was looking for the hooded figure. She believed that hooded figure to be Mara, and so she followed her to a laboratory, deducing that this would now be the time to draw her weapon. However, as she was about to kill Mara, she saw her face and was bewitched by her beauty and her grace, and this quelled Sieur's desire to see vengeance for the Diasome that she believed Mara had defeated and killed. She threw the weapon between them and told Mara that she could not bring herself to kill, but that the debt of her battle needed to be paid. She would fight Mara to the agony or die trying. And so, Mara called upon Aldrin, her brother, who would battle upon her behalf. Aldrin suggested not one but 3 duels, with blade, rifle, and 5th generation air superiority fighter. These duels and the prospect of Mara's murder troubled the Gensum scribes, as they did not want to appear to have invited murder upon the one who had extensively informed the beliefs of the Queen. It would be like killing her priest or her closest confidant. They retreated from the Echolist mission and from the Queen's court, and as the scribes fled the palace in droves, many key contractors in the mission to understand if the Echolists were correct or not sensed hesitation and withdrew their support too. To this, Queen Dingoya Pin denounced the scribes and called them faithless and selfish, which only further deepened the tensions between the Sanguine, who believed that the Covenant was complete, and the Echolists, who were even more doubtful than ever of the 7th verdict. The political tension continued to deepen as Aldrin and Sieur held their duels. The first duel was held with knives and pitted Sieur's simpler, strong jabs against Aldrin's whirling theatre of the blade. But they were equally matched, and a draw was called. In the second challenge, the two chose long rifles and hunted each other for days throughout the jungle. Whilst Aldrin blended in and used his stealthy abilities to hide and stake out the fight, Sieur simply let her blunt nature disturb the wildlife around her, which appropriately disrupted and revealed Aldrin. She shot him as he crossed a riverbed, wounding him, but not killing him. For the final challenge, the two chose 5th generation fighters with the full complement of weapons available to either of them. If the full complement could not be supplied, most crucially, it would be simulated instead, and if a simulated kill was attained, it was worth equal value to that of a real kill. Not all weapons were available. In particular, a nuclear payload was not something that the Awoken had kept around, having disposed of those weapons a long time before. Sieur chose an Ermine tactical fighter with a payload of heat-seeking missiles, and Aldrin chose a ship known as a Dart, which was an exceedingly old fighter with terrible onboard systems that would be easily outmatched by the faster Ermine. Sieur might have been able to sense that something was wrong at this point, but regardless, accepted the duel. And 8 miles out from engaging Aldrin in the middle of the sky, Sieur's computer informed her that in a simulated manner, Aldrin had killed her. In fact, he had killed her and everything in a 4-mile radius. Long ago, during an age when the Dart was constructed, the Awoken had used military-grade ship-to-ship nuclear payloads on the Dart. This was still a part of its payload, and Aldrin had simulated firing one of these, and by the result, had ended the duel, and in a simulated manner killed Sieur. After all their fighting, and after all the immense desire for revenge that Sieur held, the two were tied. Sieur threw herself before Mara, informing her that she had fought to a standstill with Aldrin. Sieur left her fate in Mara's hands, and Mara lifted her face, telling her to join them and to be of service to her. And so Sieur did, and from that day forth until her dying day, served at the right hand of Mara Sov. Later, Mara would meet with Ngoya Pin, and Ngoya would inform Mara that she was abdicating the throne. Mara had manipulated the monarchy and the Jensum scribes to ensure that her needs, both scientific and political, had been accomplished, and Ngoya knew this. This was a rebuke, as much as one could be made against Mara, but it was already too late. Mara had accomplished her purpose, and was even planning ways to implement the monarch who would supplant Ngoya. After some more time passed, Mara finally put her plan into action. She proposed to the Awoken people and her followers that the hour of their reckoning was at hand, and that the time to repay their debt to the cosmos had come. Thousands flocked to Mara's banner, and an expeditionary force was formed, creating the basis for a journey by the Awoken people into space, back through the black hole, back to where they had come from. The expedition was 12.1 billion years in the making, for time was slower within the black hole. When they would emerge, hopefully not much time would have passed at all. Mara had been preparing for this moment ever since she had been reborn. Before she departed, there were two things she had to do. The first was to ask for a boon from the first queen, Alice Lee, and the second was to say goodbye to her mother one last time. The mother who would not be joining Mara on the voyage back to Sol. In spite of all her power and all her plans and all her manipulations, Mara could not bring her mother with her. She could not convince her to change her ways. Her mother was happy and did not wish to change her life. And Mara knew no matter how much they argued, she could not be swayed. She tried nonetheless, and their final words were bitter and unresolved. But this was nothing compared to the wrath that Mara would experience at the hands of Alice Lee as they spoke later. When Mara arrived, she endeavored to tell Alice Lee the truth, and for this truth that she would tell, the boon that she would ask of Alice Lee was forgiveness. Alice Lee had long suspected that Mara was behind the Awoken people being so divided, so riven. She believed Mara to be the one who had influenced the Diasum and the Echolystes into creating a society that would always have a discontented few, feeling guilt in their debt to the universe. But she could not possibly imagine the scale and brilliance of Mara's design. Mara told her the terrible truth, that Alice Lee only believed herself to be the first being in existence in the new world of the Distributory. And she only believed herself to be the first because Mara had desired it to be that way. For it was Mara who had been the first to cross the event horizon that led to the Distributory. Mara who had designed the world and all its flaws. Mara who had planted the division in the Awoken people. Mara who had been the devil that had invented suffering and invited it into the Garden of Eden that was the Distributory. All this so that 12.1 billion years later she could enact the plan that she had set into motion, so that she could take the skeptics and the guilty and lead them back through the singularity to help fight the cosmic war that had birthed them, so that their debt to the cosmos could be repaid. It was this, the creation of suffering within a perfect world, the first sin within the Distributory, the manifestation of evil that Mara asked for forgiveness for. Forgiveness was not what she received from Alice Lee. It was only fury. It was time for Mara and the expedition to depart at long last. The Awoken were returning to the place of their true birth. Before they left the world of the Distributory, there was an alert. Retribution of some form had come for them. Missiles from the surface of the Distributory's planet were being launched, and Mara initiated an emergency launch back through the singularity. Despite the slew of missiles damaging some of the ships, the crews made it mostly unharmed. But Mara was unable to send a final message to her mother, and so she would never know any more from the woman that had raised her. But now was not the time for sorrow. Now Mara needed resolve. She returned through the singularity and emerged back in Sol. On the other side, they were greeted by a system in ruin. The collapse had taken its toll, and Sol was mostly unrecognizable. The once mighty domain of humanity was left shattered and lawless, left in squalor, and without hope of salvation or nobility. Whether Mara and the Awoken owed the debt to the cosmos was a subject of debate that one could potentially hold for 12.1 billion years, but the reality before them demanded a response now. Humanity was on its last legs, and undoubtedly the Awoken could help. Initially, they settled within the asteroid belt, around a massive string of ships, broken but tethered together near Vesta. This was a closeness that originally had kept them alive, and in the end, this was something that would serve the new life of the Awoken. This would now be their new domain, the Reef. As they settled, Keldawaj and the other Uteks who accompanied them, now known as Tekkens, divined that some kind of magic had followed them through, and that the Awoken were giving off a strange series of effects, best described as magic. They defied the powers of the universe, mathematics, gravity, just in the same way that darkness and light did, but tied to neither. Some Awoken were capable of this acausal effect and others were not, but the effect was strongest around Mara. The Awoken would then also endure a series of attacks by the Elixni, who had succeeded in following the Traveler from their system of origin all the way to its final resting place in Sol. The Awoken fought them back when they attacked. Mara and Aldrin and Zure led the charge every time. Zure's might, Aldrin's speed, and Mara's raw power delivered the Awoken to victory. It was around this time, however, that Mara would also be petitioned by the Awoken for the right to leave the fleet of ships in the Reef and to immediately aid the remnants of humanity. Mara's plan involved them building up a base of power in secret so they could better understand the system before them. The Awoken who wished to leave immediately, however, grew tired of this, and after one craft made a break for it, Mara's own wish was that the Awoken should be given a choice. In all fairness, she had no other options. Mara stated that they were given one chance, and that if they chose to leave, they would not be permitted to return. And so the once riven Awoken were riven again, and those that departed for the worlds of humanity would be of great assistance, but they would no longer be known as the Reef-born Awoken. They would be known as the Earth-born Awoken. Thus, a great people was sundered twice. The Earth-born Awoken that went out into the system were greeted by horrors present to the collapse and the following age of darkness that came with it. They would help to rebuild, but there was no longer a system in which they could see humanity flourishing immediately. The Golden Age was gone, and when the Awoken had returned, humanity had spun into a new age of existence. A dark age, when all but the faintest of hopes had been snuffed out. At the end of the collapse, and the start of this new dark age of humanity, the world was left in utter chaos. Whilst some small groups had survived in underground bunkers, such as those fortunate enough in the Black Armory, and whilst others had managed to evade destruction in the wilds, most of humanity lay dead at the hands of the terrible power that invaded the system and challenged the Traveler. We were now left shattered and broken, with no clear means of communication with our outer colonies, and with all in-system trade scuttled. Humanity was cut off and helpless. Only on Earth did anyone really face any prospect of survival or salvation. Not only did humanity face the constant pressing troubles of starvation and exposure, but they also now shared their worlds with a series of strange and deadly forces from many other reaches of the universe. The Vex, that had once been found on Venus, had surfaced on Mars and Mercury as well, and had utterly transformed Mercury from a garden world into one that was now entirely mechanical, with at least a portion of it hollowed out into a giant simulation engine known as the Infinite Forest. Aside from the Vex, a military power known as the Cabal had also sent 5 of its legions to secure Mars, and to set up a base of operations there so they could launch campaigns into the rest of the system. The 5 legions, the Sand Eaters, Dust Giants, Siege Dancers, Blind Legion, and Skyburners, fought ferociously, knowing that they could only return home if they completed their mission here. Whilst on Mars, they also began to contest the Vex for ownership of the world, but the Vex defended in great numbers, defending almost more fiercely than they did at any other place. The Elixni had also followed the Traveller into Sol, and were now known as the Fallen by the facets of humanity that encountered them, and they spread throughout the system from the Jovian moons to Venus to Earth, with several major houses such as the House of Devils and House of Winter laying claims to vast tracts of land within the territories that were once humanity's. Earth's Cosmodrome in particular was a point of great infestation. And finally, arrived the vanguard of Oryx's hive, with the hidden swarm, Blood of Oryx and Spawn of Crota, all taking root within Luna. They dug deep into our moon and prepared for yet another one of their grand conquests, creating a shadowy, subterranean fortress known as the Hellmouth, in the region formerly known as the Ocean of Storms. This would burrow so deep into the core of the moon that no light could reach its deepest recesses. These alien forces would help to set the world into chaos, and in the Dark Age, almost nobody could consider themselves to be safe from the conflict that had engulfed all the worlds of humanity. It was at this time that the first of the Lightbearers began to rise and stake their claim in the world around them. These earliest Guardians were not truly Guardians. They were tyrants who saw their newfound immortality as a tool to be abused, as well as their light. There was no duty for them, and all they sought to do was to wage war for whatever they could get their hands on. Many of them would acquire valuable weapons and assets throughout the system, and for a time, humanity's only source of hope would instead be a source of tyranny. But that is not to say that all of the risen Lightbearers were conquerors or villains. Amongst their number rose an order of men and women who would be amongst the first to hold to the true duty of the Risen, to protect humanity and to serve the light. These would be the warriors of legend who challenged and eventually defeated the warlords of Earth. They were known as Iron Lords, and the first 4 amongst their number swore on the day of their founding that they would be protectors and guardians of the people of Earth. And so, Radagast, Perun, Yolda, and Saladin represented some of the first true saviors of humanity. However, defending humanity was not an easy task. Much of them had been disconnected and were lost, broken in the terrible calamity that was the collapse. But as we always have, we survived and collected together. Sometimes into small towns, such as those most fabled places of Palamon or Coyote, who planted their flags and endeavored to make a living off of what remained of the system's bounty. But the greatest gathering of all was that of a massive camp of refugees that flocked to beneath the Traveller, to the place of its final titanic battle against the darkness. The camp began as a simple thing, defended by a few risen and huddled for warmth around fires and in furs. In such a fearful place, disillusion brewed quickly into adversity. Rudimentary factions began to rise with differing outlooks on the best way to control and run this would-be camp. These factions grew until eventually risen enforcers backed them on either side, and with them involved, conflict eventually broke out in the form of what would be known as the Faction Wars, with some among the Risen, however, seeking to end the violence. It was in this moment that the Fallen attacked the camp. The factions were broken, but the Risen, who had backed them on either side of the divide, all united and collapsed upon the Fallen with terrible power. The Fallen were repelled, and the new factions were left broken. However, this was a lesson, and the Guardians sought to see that this could never happen again, for this was truly the first point at which they could be called Guardians. For after all, had they not simply accomplished their duty to defend humanity against the invaders of the system? From this conflict, a new system of governance was born. It would be impossible to stop the factions from existing, and so the Consensus was created, as well as the Vanguard. The Consensus was a council of both the Vanguard and many represented factions, all of which would be able to submit proposals to the Speaker, a leader of sorts who had arisen with the supposed ability to speak to the Traveler. The Vanguard was something entirely different, though. The Vanguard was a part of the Consensus, but they were a council of 3 Guardians, one from each discipline: Hunter, Titan, and Warlock. With them, the Guardians would be represented, and with them, they would be officially classified. And so at last, laws were passed and enacted, and a government with clear authority in hand was born. With it, the turmoil of the people began to cease, and what was once a small camp of refugees beneath the Traveler began to grow and blossom, first into a settlement, and then into a bastion. The final bastion beneath our broken god. They would call it the Last City.